Hi everyone, my name is Johanna and I'm Professor of Human Geography at University College London in the UK. I'm also co-director of the Migration Research Unit at UCL and visiting fellow of Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. I'm really delighted to be with you today and to be giving this keynote address at your conference. And before I start my talk, I'm just going to share some slides with you. Okay, so hopefully you can see my title slide and also can see and hear me as well. So the title of my talk is Social Science Perspectives on Student Mobilities for Higher Education. This is a topic that, as a social scientist myself, as a geographer, but also a geographer that works across disciplines in sociology and also education studies, I've been working on different perspectives on international student mobility in particular for a number of years, 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. And a lot of the perspectives that I'm going to highlight today relate to work that has been published in 2 books, although I do have a number of other books as well. So the first book on the left came out in 2011 with my colleague Rachel Brooks. And this book was a critical review of the academic literature at that time on international student mobilities, how these relate to migration, and also the internationalization of higher education, which I'm sure is something that you're all interested in some way or other. The book on the right, Student Migrants and Contemporary Educational Mobilities, this is about to come out, so this will be available to purchase. If you'd be interested in doing so, I'd be very delighted, in September by Palgrave. And this book is really, so it's a completely new book. It's completely restructured from the first book, but it's really a look back over the previous 10 years of scholarship coming out of the social sciences on student mobility and international higher education. So these are where these books are kind of, the arguments made in these books are some of the arguments that I'm going to be making today. So I've identified 4 what you could call perspectives on international student mobility that I want to focus on in my talk today. And those are the geographies of student mobilities, a capital accumulation approach, institutional and state strategies, and finally to reflect on an issue that's increasingly important in these debates and hasn't been for many years, has been ignored, but over the past sort of maybe 5 years or so, researchers have been increasingly interested in the ethical considerations when we're thinking about international student mobility. So to begin with, geographies of student mobilities. Now, as I've mentioned, I'm a geographer, so I am almost kind of predisposed to think about the geographies of the phenomena that I'm studying. What I would argue, and I think many colleagues of mine would agree, is that geographies are fundamental. You can't understand what is happening, the processes that are happening, and how they're interconnected around student mobilities without thinking about geography and geographies. So they're fundamental, and they're implicit in a lot of scholarship, a lot of policy debate around student mobility, but they're often, or have in the past at least, been often ignored and not addressed head on in the way that Rachel Brooks and I in our books have attempted to do. Much of the debate, if we're thinking of kind of broad scale geographies, if we think about dividing the world up into these kind of broad regions, much of the debate has focused on student mobility from the east to the west, from the global north to the global, from the global south to the global north. So that narrative has very much dominated a lot of the discussion up until very recently. And there's good reasons for that. OECD have been very instrumental as an international organisation collecting data on international student mobility, and certainly their data support this this discourse that vast majority of students are moving from parts of Asia to Western Europe, North America, and the UK as well is very popular. Also, the vast majority of students are moving from countries, regions of the world that are less affluent or have been described as the global south, to countries that are more affluent, where there's more opportunity, or there's at least seen to be more opportunity for in terms of jobs, careers, and so on. And I will come to the link to capital accumulation in a minute. So, you know, the US and the UK remain the top two receiving countries of international students in the world, and they have been for many years. However, what we're also seeing are new and emergent geographies that encompass regional patterns of international student mobility. And within these regional patterns, we see the rise of China. So the role that China is playing as a host of international students and not just the predominant sending country. So for many years, China has topped the charts when it comes to sending students overseas for higher education, whether it's for undergraduate, masters, or PhDs. Now China is number 3 in the charts as a host country. So increasingly China, and I'll come back to China when I talk about state strategies, is receiving international students. And what we see around that are emergent regional patterns. So students within Asia, rather than moving to the West, are actually moving to China, to Singapore, to Malaysia for their higher education. And we see a lot more inter-Asian, intra-regional mobility, which is important to kind of appreciate. And the final point I want to make in terms of geographies is about the significance of different scales. So we do tend to limit these debates to the national scale. So there's a methodological nationalism in much of what we talk about. We tend to prioritize the nation state. We tend to put it on a pedestal. We tend to think about policy and mobility in terms of states. And I'll come back to this, but there's good reason that we do this. But if we're thinking about the kind of vast array of student experiences of international student mobility, you know, students rarely experience the state. I mean, they experience the state when they have to get a visa and they have to cross borders. But once they're there, once they've entered their host country, students' experiences are far more regional or city-based or campus-based, or even focused on where they're residing, so their home, while they're international students. And again, the literature is reflecting this. We see much more discussion of international student mobility, say it's a kind of regional level. We see much more discussion of international students as agents of urban change, so actually as consumers changing the landscape of cities. So we see more shops and leisure facilities and so on catering specifically to international students. We see, you know, residency blocks being built, purposefully built to house international students. We also see the role and the imprint of international students on our campuses in universities around the world. So these different scales, again, are very geographical and are something that are worth thinking about. So another dominant perspective, probably the most dominant perspective when we think about social science approaches to understanding international student mobility, is what we could call a capital accumulation approach. So this perspective draws heavily on Pierre Bourdieu's ideas around forms of capital. I'm sure many of you will be familiar. Bourdieu was a French theorist, anthropologist and sociologist, and he developed this idea around the way social life is constructed based on the accumulation of different forms of capital. So for ease here, we'll just talk about social, cultural, and economic. International study can involve all of those. So it can involve the development of social capital, so networks, friendships, acquaintances that will help you get a job down the line. So things that are kind of equivalent to Guanxi, for example. And then cultural capital, I'll come back to that because that's kind of key. Economic capital is less important during study, although a lot of international students do work and they do accumulate economic capital at the same time as being international students. But really, what we're focusing on in this literature is how students convert social capital and cultural capital into economic capital in the workplace. Then we might want to think about how international mobility for education is utilized as a strategy for capital accumulation, so that students intentionally engage in international study because they want to accumulate different types of capital. International credentials, so getting a university degree from a top US, UK institution. These credentials are a form of what Bourdieu would call institutionalized cultural capital. So the degree certificate from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and so on represents a very, very valuable form of institutionalized cultural capital. But apart from the credentials, which are obviously really important for students, students are also acquiring a range of embodied cultural capital. What does embodied mean? Well, it includes things like linguistic competencies, so becoming fluent in another language, and English has kind of become dominant in many of these debates. It involves how you dress, your comportment, sense of humor, understanding of kind of nuances of language, being able to kind of interact with people from different backgrounds. And in terms of converting that into kind of the workplace, often many international students will go into the private sector and they will try and work in private sector organizations that are very international in outlook. So being able to prove that they embody a kind of cosmopolitan international outlook is very important for many international students. Overall, this kind of capital accumulation approach, this idea of seeing international study as being primarily about accumulating different forms of capital, as I've mentioned, is the most dominant of all approaches. I just want to spend a few moments thinking about institutional state strategies, and particularly state strategies. So even though I argued earlier that we tend to overly focus on the role of the nation state, what we do see is that the nation state remains very important in international student mobility, in driving it, in shaping it, and so on. So what ways do states impact student mobility? They offer scholarships. This is a big one. And this is one where we can hold China up as a particular model of excellence here. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, just to give one example, China offers thousands of scholarships to students who otherwise could not afford to study in China every year. Another example might be Singapore and Singapore's talent program, foreign talent program. Many students from China would go to Singapore, they would receive scholarships for their study, and they would be encouraged to stay in Singapore and work, so to invest back in the city-state after their graduation. So scholarships, offering student scholarships is one way in which states are very much intervening in these patterns of student mobility. And related to this are incentives to return. So many states, such as China, actively encourage international students that go overseas to study to come back, whether it's tax breaks or housing benefits, or in the case of China, and access to city hukou. There are many examples in the literature of the way in which states actively encourage international students to return and stay and create a home and get a job and put down their roots back in their home country. International states are also concerned with building a knowledge or global knowledge economy, and one of the ways in which they're doing this, of course, is investing in their education systems. So this might include higher education, and also might include this idea that international higher education is a particularly valuable thing to strive for. Then the fourth bullet point refers to transnational educational initiatives. So many countries around the world, including the UK, also China, Hong Kong, Special Administrative Region, Singapore, Malaysia, they offer students the opportunity to undertake transnational education. In other words, to get a degree from an overseas or foreign educational provider at home. So they welcome in international universities to come and set up shop and to offer their degree programs to their local students. And this links to the last bullet point, really, and that's the role of education cities or urban hubs. As many of you will be aware, in many states, the UAE is perhaps the most famous, have areas where investment in education and higher education is very much encouraged, and it becomes a focus of this particular geographic area. It also becomes the focus of regional inward mobility of students. So encouraging foreign universities to set up in these areas, encouraging domestic universities to set up in these areas and to develop partnerships with foreign universities. And also then to bring students from outside of the country, but within the wider region, in to study in these hubs, has become an important strategy for many states. And the final point I want to touch on, and there's been much less work on this in terms of social science, but it's becoming increasingly important and increasingly popular subject of study, is how international student mobility engages with, or doesn't engage with, in fact, ethics, and how an ethical perspective on student mobility is very much needed. And there's different aspects to this, so I'm just going to touch on some of them now. So one concerns the way in which international students have been framed in the host country. Many host countries, such as the UK, for example, have tended to see international students as a valuable source of income. But that has become the dominant image of international students. Excuse me. And arguably that is a very limited view and very problematic, because it kind of ignores students as agents, it ignores students as people with opinions and a sense that they want to experience a particular type of higher education, and actually it becomes translated as international students as cash cows, as the second bullet point says. So there are, so this is problematic, because this creates a very circumscribed view of what an international student is, who an international student is, and what we can expect from the international student, but also, what the international student expects from the host country and the host institution. There is very much a kind of transactional relationship implied in a lot of these discussions. The international student pays extortionate tuition fees to gain a degree certificate, with very little discussion of what their experiences are, like in the middle of that kind of transaction. And I think COVID-19, one of the things it has done is expose some quite dire treatment of international students. And many international students, when the UK, for example, Australia, went into lockdown and leisure and restaurants were shut down temporarily, international students lost sources of income when they would otherwise have been working part-time, and many found themselves destitute. Many found themselves unable to feed themselves. Some even found themselves homeless. And there were lots of pictures in the UK media of international students kind of queuing up for food banks because they had no other way of getting food. So I think COVID-19 has exposed some problematic assumptions around international students, that they're all wealthy, privileged individuals who can be viewed as cash cows, and there's no need to sort of see them in any other way. And the third bullet point links to this. There's just been a lack of voice. International students there's very little literature that actually allows you to hear the students' voices, actually allows students to express their opinions, on what they've been experiencing, what went well, what hasn't been going so well, and so on. So this, again, we need, in order to respect and value international students, we also need to hear them. We also need to hear their voices. And the final point relates to a very interesting article that Claire Madge and colleagues published in 2009. And they were working with Bell Hooks' idea of engaged pedagogy. So they argued that we need a far more engaged pedagogical approach to international students. So in other words, we don't just bring international students in, impart our knowledge, they leave, but we actually engage in a far more sensitive and ethical way with their experiences, with their views, with their wishes, with their culture, cultural backgrounds, and so on and so on. And I think post-COVID, that has become more apparent than ever. So in conclusion, I would say there has been in the past 10, 15 years a burgeoning interest within the social sciences in international student mobility. Part of this, I think, reflects a recognition that internationalization of higher education is happening. It's happening around the world. It's happening to the institutions that we work in, the institutions that our children will be attending, and so on and so on. It is happening, and we need to understand it. And one of the ways we can understand it is to understand how students are mobile between institutions, between countries, between cities, and so on and so on. There's also a sense that we need to be more cognizant of the role that students play as migrants, but also as potential future citizens. So, countries like Australia, city-states like Singapore, have really grasped this idea that international students are potential future, either permanent residents or citizens of the state. And so they need to be supported, they need to be encouraged, they need to be offered jobs, and they need to be offered visas which allow them to stay post-study to work in the country, and then hopefully to retain the knowledge that they've gained in the state. I think the final point I'd just like to make refers to these ongoing inequities that exist in international student mobility. So I mentioned that there's this kind of misconception that all international students are wealthy, all international students are privileged. However, it is true that the vast majority of international students are relatively privileged, are relatively wealthy. Even students on scholarships, the literature is showing, tend to be the more privileged individuals in their respective societies. So we do need to be more aware of inequity, inequality, and how some students are benefiting from student mobility, whereas others, are shut out. We also need to be aware that as international student mobility diversifies, so as there are more opportunities for different types of student mobility, some talk about regional mobility, for example, students that from South Korea that choose to go to Singapore to learn English rather than to the UK to learn English, or the US to learn English. It is cheaper. Less privileged students are able to go to Singapore than those that go to the US. But are they getting the same valuable experience. So I think what we need more research understanding the differences within international student mobility and how those differences are potentially perpetuating social inequality. And I would say, as a final note, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was interesting, and I welcome any questions that you'd like to send me, and I will do my best to respond. Thank you.